My in-laws called me useless at their country club for 22 years. That is not a metaphor. That is not me being dramatic for effect. I mean, they stood in rooms full of people who knew our names, people who had watched my daughter grow from a baby into a little girl who could recite all 50 state capitals, and they called me useless. A burden, dead weight on their daughter's future. For 22 years, I kept my mouth shut and I kept building. And then, at their 50th wedding anniversary gala, on a Saturday evening in October with 43 people watching, I handed my wife a sealed envelope from our estate attorney, and I watched the room understand something it had never understood before. The lawyer stepped forward. I want to be clear about something before I tell you the rest. Some people in my family still think I went too far. After everything you are about to hear, I genuinely want to know what you think, because I have turned this over in my mind 100 times in the months since that night, and I still land in the same place every time. Let me tell you how we got here. My wife's name is Camille Beaumont. She kept the hyphen when we married because her mother, Diane Beaumont, made it a condition she didn't say out loud, but communicated through 16 years of pointed silence whenever Camille used only Achafer in a social setting. Camille is brilliant, genuinely funny, and the most capable person I have ever known. She is also, and I say this with love and with the particular exhaustion of someone who has lived inside this dynamic for over 2 decades, someone who was raised to believe that her parents' approval was the same thing as oxygen. You didn't argue with Diane and Gerald Beaumont. You accommodated them. You adjusted. You found ways to make the room comfortable for everyone except yourself. I am Nora Scott. I kept my name entirely. That should have told the Beaumonts everything they needed to know about me from the beginning, and in a way, it did. Gerald Beaumont built his money in commercial real estate across the Mid-Atlantic corridor, the kind of portfolio that looks modest on paper until you see the actual numbers, which I eventually did. He was old money crossed with new money, which is the most dangerous combination because it carries the entitlement of the former and the insecurity of the latter. Diane came from a family with a longer pedigree and considerably less cash, which meant she spent her entire marriage performing a version of wealth that was slightly more refined than anything Gerald had actually earned. She wore that performance like a second skin. Camille was their only child. That is important. Not a child among siblings who could absorb some of the pressure. The only one, every dream they had ever parked somewhere in their chests was aimed directly at her. When Camille brought me home for the first time in late autumn nearly 23 years ago, what Diane saw was a woman who worked in property law, drove a used Volkswagen, and had the audacity to correct Gerald's description of an easement over dinner. What she decided in that first hour, and never revised, was that I was a problem to be managed. The first time Diane called me useless, my daughter had not yet been born. We were at the club, which is what they called it, always just the club, as if naming it specifically would have been too pedestrian, and Gerald was holding court about an office park development outside Annapolis he had structured with a group of investors. I said something about the title transfer timeline that was factually accurate and mildly corrective. Nothing cruel, nothing even particularly assertive. And Diane, without lowering her voice, leaned toward the woman beside her and said, loud enough for me to hear, that Camille had married someone who was entirely useless, professionally speaking, just a small firm attorney with big opinions. I remember thinking in that moment that I had 2 choices. I could defend myself and spend the next decade being the woman who made a scene at the club, or I could say nothing, go home, and do something about it. I went home and called my mentor, an estate attorney named Gordon Chu, who had been practicing for 30 years and who had, over the course of the previous 2 years, quietly helped me understand things about asset protection and property structure that most people only learn after they have already lost something. I told him what Diane had said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in that particular tone he had that was dry without being dismissive, that the most satisfying response to someone who underestimates you is never to correct them. It is to let the correction arrive on its own, in its own time, with documentation. I kept that in a place inside me for a very long time. Camille and I had been together for 4 years when our daughter was born. Her name is Josephine, and she is the reason everything I am about to describe happened in the order it did, and with the particular precision it required. Josephine is mine biologically, from a relationship before Camille, and Camille adopted her when Josephine was 2 years old through a formal court proceeding. She is our daughter in every sense that matters, legally and otherwise. The Beaumonts tolerated Josephine the way they tolerated me, which is to say they included her in Christmas cards and forgot her preferences in every other context. Josephine, who is now 8 years old, is the kind of child who notices everything and says approximately 40% of what she notices, which means she is constantly watching and only occasionally commenting, and her comments are always accurate. The second incident that shaped how I understood the Beaumont dynamic happened when Josephine was about 3. Diane had arranged a small luncheon at the club, ostensibly to introduce a friend's son who had recently joined a commercial real estate firm and whom she felt Camille should know professionally. I came because Camille asked me to, and because I had learned that absences were interpreted as weakness. We sat at a round table with 6 people, and at some point the conversation turned to career trajectories, the way it always did in that room, and the friend's son, whose name was Trenton something, asked what I did. I told him I worked in property law with a focus on estate planning and asset structuring. Diane, without looking up from her salad, said that Nora did some legal work on the side, mostly document review, and that it kept her busy. Trenton nodded politely. I set my fork down with considerable care. Then I picked it up again and finished my lunch, because I had learned something that year that I want to tell you clearly. I was, at that exact moment, midway through drafting the trust documents for a beachfront estate that would become the most consequential piece of property in this entire story. I had been working with Gordon Chu for 3 years by then, and together we had structured something that Diane Beaumont, for all her social fluency, did not have the legal literacy to understand even if I had explained it to her at that table with a whiteboard and colored markers. I did not explain it to her. I smiled at Trenton and asked him about the Annapolis market. If you have ever been counted out by someone who should have known better, you know exactly what that particular silence feels like. It is not defeat. It is patience with a very specific end date. The third incident, and the one that moved from personal to something I could not set aside, happened at a 4th of July gathering when Josephine was 5 years old. By then she was old enough to understand tone even when she couldn't decode vocabulary. Diane was telling a story about a family they knew whose children had attended a particular private school in Baltimore, and how the school had shaped those children into exactly the kind of people the world needed more of. She mentioned tuition. She mentioned legacy admissions. She mentioned, in a voice calibrated just above a whisper, that it was a shame some children didn't have the kind of foundational support that made those opportunities available. Josephine was sitting 2 feet away, eating a piece of watermelon with the focused intensity only a 5-year-old can bring to fruit. I watched my daughter's face. She didn't understand the specifics, but she understood the shape of what was being said. I saw it in the way she stopped chewing for a moment and looked at her watermelon instead of at Diane. That was the moment I called the whole thing accelerated. Not because Diane had insulted me again, but because she had aimed somewhere she had no business aiming, and I was not going to spend another decade letting that continue. The following Monday morning, I called an attorney named Sylvia Ramos, a family and estate law specialist with an office in Bethesda who had been recommended to me by Gordon Chu 2 years earlier, and whom I had been meaning to call since the previous spring. I had my first consultation with Sylvia on a Tuesday in early July of that year. I did not tell Camille I was going. I told her I had a client meeting, which was true in the relevant sense, because what I was going to establish that morning was more consequential than any billable client I had managed in the previous 12 months. Sylvia Ramos was a compact woman in her early 50s with reading glasses she kept on a chain and a habit of writing in margins of documents while you were still talking. She asked me 3 questions in the first 10 minutes that no one had ever asked me before. What did I want to protect? From whom did I need to protect it? And on what timeline was I working? I told her. She wrote in the margins. Then she put her pen down and looked at me over her glasses and said that what I was describing was entirely achievable and that we should begin immediately. The beachfront estate had been in a trust my parents established before their deaths, a trust that named me as the sole living beneficiary, and that had been structured, through Gordon Chu's early counsel and a significant amount of my parents' foresight, in a way that kept it entirely separate from any marital assets. The property sat on approximately 4 acres on the Maryland shore. The land itself, even before the structure on it was considered, was worth something close to $38 million at the time I sat across from Sylvia Ramos that Tuesday morning, and the assessed value had been climbing for years. By the time of the gala, the total worth would approach $42 million. No one in the Beaumont family knew this property existed. Not Gerald, who thought he understood real estate. Not Diane, who thought she understood everything. Not even Camille, because I had kept the trust documents in a file at Gordon Chu's office since I was 29 years old, and the structure my parents had created was one that did not surface in any of the typical searches or disclosures that came up in our shared financial life. This was not a secret born of deception. It was a boundary I had built the way you build anything important, carefully, with good materials, over a long time. My parents had been deliberate people. They had worked with Gordon because they understood that the people who come into your life after the assets are established are not always the same people who deserve access to them. They had made choices about structure and documentation that I had honored, not because I distrusted Camille, but because there are some things that belong to you categorically, the way your name belongs to you, and the beachfront estate was one of those things. What changed the morning after the 4th of July gathering was not the existence of the estate. It was my decision about what to do with it and when. Sylvia and I worked together for the next several months, establishing the legal architecture for what I had in mind. Part of that work involved updating the trust documents to name Josephine as a secondary beneficiary, administered through a structured trustee arrangement that would activate under specific conditions. Gordon Chu acted as the originating trustee. Sylvia handled the updated documentation. Neither of them ever discussed the matter with anyone outside of our professional relationship. There was also the matter of Josephine's college fund. I had opened a 529 account for her the year she was born and had been contributing to it steadily and quietly. By the time she turned 8, that account held just over $68,000, which was not a dramatic number but was mine, and I had built it without anyone's help or awareness. Josephine's health insurance was through my firm's plan, not through anything the Beaumonts controlled or contributed to, and I had made sure that was the case since the year she started school. Josephine also saw a pediatric specialist twice a year for a mild auditory processing issue, and those appointments were fully covered and fully documented under my coverage. I had arranged her world so that nothing the Beaumonts could withdraw or restrict would touch her. This was the architecture. Now let me tell you about the close calls, because there were 2 that still make the back of my neck feel tight when I think about them. The first happened about 14 months before the gala, at a Sunday dinner at the Beaumont house in Chevy Chase. Gerald had been talking about a property deal he was considering, a commercial parcel outside Ocean City, and he mentioned, in the way Gerald mentioned things that were meant to land somewhere, that the shoreline market was getting complicated because of recent trust litigation in the circuit courts. He looked at me when he said it. Not a long look. Just a flick of his eyes, the way you check a gauge. "Nora," he said, and he paused with his wine glass halfway to his mouth. "You've worked with shore properties before, haven't you? In that trust practice of yours." Camille was passing the salad. Josephine was at the other end of the table telling her grandmother about something that had happened at school, a story involving a classroom turtle and a boy named Derek, and Diane was half listening to Josephine and half watching me. I told Gerald. It's specialized work. The title history on shoreline parcels gets complicated very quickly. He nodded as if I had confirmed something. Any personal involvement. Investment-wise, I took a piece of bread. I stick to what I know professionally. It keeps things cleaner. Gerald hummed. He set his wine glass down. He looked at me for another half-second longer than was comfortable, and then Josephine said something about the turtle escaping under a bookshelf, and the table's attention moved where children's stories always pull a table's attention. I breathed very slowly for the rest of that dinner. When we were in the car afterward, Camille asked me if I was tired. I told her yes. She put her hand over mine on the console and didn't ask anything else. That Monday, I called Sylvia, not because I thought Gerald had found anything, but because I needed to hear from someone with 30 years of estate law experience that what I had built was tight. She reviewed everything. She called me back in 2 days. "There is nothing to find," she said, "because there is nothing to find. It is structured exactly the way it should be." If someone looked, they would see a trust holding real property with a named beneficiary. There are no flags, there is no exposure. You are fine. I believed her. But I filed the conversation with Gerald under the category of things I needed to resolve before the timeline I had been building toward. The second close call was sharper and came from a direction I had not anticipated. About 7 months before the gala, Josephine came home from school one afternoon and sat at the kitchen table and asked me, in the particular careful voice she uses when she's been thinking about something for a long time, whether we were rich. I sat down across from her. "Why are you asking that?" She picked at a corner of her homework folder. "Grandma Diane told Grandpa Gerald that you probably had some money somewhere, and that it wasn't fair because Mom's family worked for everything they have." I kept my face very still. I asked Josephine as calmly as I could when she had heard this. "At the 4th of July thing, this one." She meant the most recent gathering, not the one 2 years earlier. I was behind the couch getting my shoe. An 8-year-old behind a couch getting her shoe. I told Josephine that our family was comfortable and that we didn't need to worry about what other people thought about our money. She looked at me with those eyes that she gets, the ones that are doing more math than the words coming out of her mouth suggest, and she said, "Okay. But I don't think Grandma Diane likes you very much." I told her that sometimes adults had complicated relationships and that what mattered was that our family was solid. She accepted this with the pragmatic grace that 8-year-olds sometimes surprise you with. After she went to her room, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and texted Sylvia 3 words, "Moving up timeline." She responded within the hour, "Understood, call tomorrow." The next morning I was in her office at 9. We went through everything with a precision I had not applied since the initial structuring work years earlier. Sylvia spread the documents across her desk, and we went through the deed, the trust language, the beneficiary designations, the trustee succession plan. She confirmed that Josephine's position was protected, that my position was protected, and that the property was held in a manner that was legally unassailable by anyone who was not already a named party in the original trust documents. Then she asked me what I wanted to do at the gala. The Beaumonts' 50th wedding anniversary had been planned for the autumn. Gerald and Diane had booked the main dining room at the club, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the water, and they had invited 43 people who represented the full geography of their social world. Business contacts, old friends, a few distant family members, the couple who had stood as witnesses at their wedding 5 decades ago. Camille had been asked to organize the evening's program. She had spent weeks on the details, the flowers, the seating chart, the carefully worded tribute that she would deliver about her parents' marriage and what it had meant to her. I had agreed to attend. Naturally, I had attended every gathering for 22 years. Sylvia asked me again what I wanted. I told her I wanted to give Camille the deed to the beachfront estate as a gift, as a statement. As a correction of the record that Diane Beaumont had been writing about me for 2 decades in rooms full of people who now believed her version. I wanted to do it in front of the 43 people who had heard the word useless applied to me, either directly or through the accumulated weight of Diane's social commentary over those years. I wanted to hand my wife an envelope from an attorney and let the contents speak in the language that Gerald and Diane Beaumont understood better than any other, documented value. Sylvia was quiet for a moment. She tapped her pen against the desk twice. "That's your right," she said. "You own the property. You can transfer or gift as you choose within the trust parameters, but I want you to understand something before we proceed." She leaned forward slightly. "Once you do this in that room in that way, the conversation changes permanently. With your wife, with her parents, with yourself. Are you certain?" I thought about Josephine behind the couch getting her shoe. I thought about the word useless, delivered in a voice designed to carry. "File everything," I told Sylvia. "We're going with the original timeline." She nodded and wrote something in the margin of the page in front of her. "I'll have the deed transfer documentation prepared. We will need to coordinate the presentation envelope with your attorney's seal. I'll also be present at the event in case there are questions that require immediate legal clarification." I looked at her. "You'd come?" She looked back at me over her reading glasses. "Nora, I have been practicing estate law for 31 years. I have never once had the opportunity to hand someone a $42 million deed at an anniversary party." A pause. "I would not miss it." Everything I had built across 22 years of silence was about to be tested in front of 43 people who had never once imagined they would need to revise their opinion of me. The timing, as it turned out, could not have been more precise. Because 3 weeks before the gala, Diane Beaumont did something that transformed what I had planned as a quiet correction into something I no longer had any interest in keeping quiet. 3 weeks before the gala, Diane Beaumont enrolled Josephine in a different school without telling me. I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment, because even now, months later, it still has a particular weight to it that I cannot fully describe in ordinary language. Not a different after-school program. Not a different weekend activity. A different school. Diane had contacted the private school in Baltimore she had been promoting for years at family gatherings, the one with the legacy admissions and the tuition she liked to mention casually as a measure of aspiration, and she had submitted an application on Josephine's behalf using information she had collected. I still do not entirely know how, over the previous several months. She had listed herself as Josephine's grandmother and primary educational coordinator. She had described Josephine's current school as inadequate. She had, in the section requesting the names of the child's parents, listed Camille first and left my name off entirely. I found out because the school called me, not Diane, me. The admissions coordinator, a careful woman named Felicia Huang who had been doing this work for 11 years, had looked up Josephine's current school records and found that the primary contact listed was a Nora Scott, not a Diane Beaumont, and she called the number on file to verify the application. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September. I was at my desk reviewing a deed transfer. I answered on the second ring. Felicia Huang introduced herself, named the school, and asked whether I was the parent who had submitted an application for an 8-year-old named Josephine. I told her I had not submitted any application. A pause on the line. The careful kind, the kind a professional uses when they understand that what they are about to say needs to be delivered precisely. "Mrs. Scott," Felicia Huang said, "we received an application last week from someone identifying as the child's grandmother, a Diane Beaumont." She described herself as the educational coordinator for the family. The application includes Josephine's current school records, her fall assessment scores, and a personal statement about the child's academic needs. Another pause. "We require a parent or legal guardian to authorize any application for a student under 18. When the primary contact name on Josephine's current school file didn't match the applicant's name, our admissions team flagged it for verification." I had stopped moving entirely. My pen was in my hand, and I was not writing. "Can you tell me?" I asked, and I heard my own voice come out very level, which surprised me because the inside of my chest felt like something was vibrating at the wrong frequency. "What documents were submitted?" Felicia Huang walked me through the list. Current school records, assessment scores, a copy of what appeared to be a letter from a pediatric specialist regarding Josephine's auditory processing needs, recommending additional educational support. A personal statement, written by Diane, describing Josephine's home educational environment in terms I will not repeat here because they were about me and they were not accurate, and they were designed to make the school believe that Josephine's current situation was one that required outside intervention. When Felicia finished the list, I thanked her for calling. I told her to withdraw the application entirely and to note in Josephine's inquiry file that no further contact from Diane Beaumont should be considered authorized. Felicia confirmed she would do so immediately. I put the phone down on my desk. I sat there for approximately 3 minutes, which felt much longer, doing the kind of arithmetic you do when something crosses from personal into documented. Diane had accessed Josephine's school records without my authorization. She had obtained information from what sounded like a medical file, either directly or through some social means I had not yet identified. She had submitted a fraudulent application misrepresenting herself as an authorized educational coordinator. She had written a personal statement about me to a third-party institution that contained characterizations designed to damage my standing as a parent. I picked up my phone and called Sylvia Ramos. Sylvia picked up on the third ring, and before I had finished describing what Felicia Huang had told me, her voice had shifted into the specific register she used when something had moved from advisory to operational. "Get me the name and direct line for the admissions coordinator," she said. I'll need to send a formal letter withdrawing the application and requesting that the school retain any documents submitted as part of that inquiry. We want a paper record of what was submitted. Already withdrawn, I told her. I asked Felicia Huang to retain the file. A beat. Good. How did Dan get Josephine's school records? I didn't know yet. That part I didn't know. Get Josephine's school on the phone this afternoon, Sylvia told me. Find out if anyone authorized a records release. If someone did it without your consent, that is a FERPA violation, and it becomes part of the documentation we bring to the gala. If Diane obtained those records through social means, talking directly to a teacher or an administrator, we document that too. I called Josephine's school 20 minutes later. The vice principal, a man named Robert Adami, who had been at the school for 9 years, was visibly uncomfortable when I explained why I was calling. He confirmed that 3 weeks earlier, a woman identifying as Josephine's grandmother had come into the front office and spoken with the school secretary. She had asked about Josephine's progress, mentioned that she was helping the family evaluate additional options, and the secretary, who had seen Diane at school events and recognized her face, had printed a summary of Josephine's recent assessments and handed it across the front desk. No formal release authorization. No parent signature. A face the secretary recognized, and a confident demeanor, and a story that sounded plausible. Robert Adami apologized 3 times in the space of 2 minutes. I told him I appreciated the transparency, asked him to document the interaction in writing, and told him I would be in touch through our attorney regarding the proper protocols going forward. Then I called Sylvia back. It gets worse, I told her, and I described the front office conversation. Sylvia was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was precise the way a scalpel is precise. She used social access to obtain protected records and submitted them to a third-party institution as part of a fraudulent enrollment application. This is serious, Nora. This is not a family overreach. This is documented misconduct involving your child's educational records. I told Sylvia I was not going to the police. Not because what Diane had done was acceptable, but because Camille was Diane's daughter and Josephine's mother, and the person I was married to, and I was not going to put a criminal complaint against Camille's mother into the public record 3 weeks before I was already planning the most significant legal disclosure of my adult life. What I was going to do instead was make sure that every single document from every single phone call and every single school interaction was in Sylvia's files before the night of the gala. And then, in front of 43 people who had spent 22 years watching Diane Beaumont describe me as useless, I was going to let the full picture speak. Sylvia understood. She told me she would be at the gala with a full portfolio. I spent the next 20 days doing what I had done for 22 years, which was to keep my face composed and my movements deliberate and my voice steady in every room that contained a Beaumont. I went to a pre-gala family dinner at the Beaumont house in Chevy Chase the week before the event. I sat at their table, and I ate the food, and I listened to Gerald talk about market trends, and I watched Diane move through the room with the particular confidence of someone who believes they have just done something clever and gotten away with it. She patted my arm twice that evening. Both times I smiled. I am still with you. Stay. Because what happened at that gala is the reason I have been telling you this story. The evening of the 50th anniversary fell on the 2nd Saturday of October, the kind of autumn evening in Maryland where the air has just enough chill to make the warmth indoors feel earned. Camille had arranged everything with the attention to detail she brings to every task she cares about. White arrangements on every table, a program printed on cardstock, a string quartet for the first hour, a slide presentation of photographs from the 5 decades of the Beaumont's marriage. She had spent the previous 2 weeks in a state of focused, loving preparation, and I had watched her work and felt, as I always did when I watched Camille care about something, the particular tenderness that exists when you love someone who has been shaped by people who are not entirely worthy of the love they receive. Josephine was with my cousin Adela that evening. Adela lived 15 minutes from the club and had kept Josephine before at events where I had determined the environment was not one I wanted my daughter inside. I had made this arrangement 2 weeks prior, which tells you something about what I had already decided. I arrived at the club at 6:45 in the evening in a black dress I had owned for 4 years, and a pair of shoes Camille had given me for my birthday the year before. I had the envelope from Sylvia in the inside pocket of the small bag I was carrying. The envelope was sealed, cream-colored, embossed with Sylvia's firm name in the upper left corner. It had the weight of something that had taken 22 years to arrive. The main dining room was set for 50. Not all 43 guests had arrived yet, but the room was filling, and the quality of light from the floor-to-ceiling windows, which looked out over the water in the last of the evening, was the kind of thing that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Gerald was near the bar with two men I recognized from his professional circle. He saw me come in, nodded once, and went back to his conversation. Diane was at the center of the room, working it the way she always worked a room, moving between clusters of people with the smoothness of someone who had been performing social ease for 5 decades. She was wearing a deep champagne-colored dress and a necklace I had never seen before, something with stones that caught the light in a way that was designed to catch the light. When she saw me, her expression did not change noticeably. Her hand went briefly to the necklace, a small unconscious gesture, and then she smiled and moved toward Camille, who was adjusting something at the head table. I found a position near the windows and I stood there and I breathed. The dinner was served at 7:30. Camille gave her tribute at 8:15, and it was genuinely moving, the kind of speech that required her to pause twice to collect herself, and I watched her from my seat and felt the strange layered emotion of loving your wife and grieving the family she had been assigned. Gerald had actual tears in his eyes. Diane did not cry, but her expression, for approximately 4 minutes, was the softest I had ever seen it. That was the human moment I had to hold in mind for what came next. The dessert course arrived at 9. By 9:20, the room was in the post-dinner looseness that comes with champagne and accumulated sentiment, and people were moving between tables, and the string quartet had given way to recorded music at a civilized volume. And Gerald stood and made a toast to Diane that was surprisingly tender given the man I knew him to be. Diane received it with her chin lifted, and when she spoke in response, she talked about the family they had built and the legacy they were protecting and the values they had passed to the next generation. She looked at Camille when she said this. She did not look at me. I reached into my bag and took out the envelope. I walked to where Camille was standing near the head table, and I touched her arm, and when she turned, I put the envelope into her hands. I did not say anything dramatic. I did not make an announcement. I simply placed the envelope in her hands and stepped back one step. Camille looked at the envelope. She looked at me. Her expression was curious and slightly uncertain in the way that her expressions get when she doesn't have enough information yet to know what she's feeling. "What is this?" Her voice was low. "Open it." She looked at the envelope again. Sylvia Ramos, Estate Law, embossed in the upper left corner. The sealed flap with the firm's red sticker across it. Camille ran her thumb under the flap. Gerald, from 4 feet away, noticed his daughter opening something formal-looking, and his conversation paused. The two men he had been speaking with followed his gaze. A small cluster of quiet began to form the way quiet forms when people in a room sense that something is shifting without yet knowing what. Diane turned from another conversation and saw Camille with the open envelope. Her hand went back to her necklace. Camille withdrew the documents. There were 3 pages, the cover sheet from Sylvia's firm, the deed transfer document, and a 1-page summary of the property details, assessed value, trust history, and recorded ownership. I watched my wife's eyes move across the first line of the deed transfer document. I watched them stop. I watched her go back and review the beginning of that line again, the way you do when the words don't assemble into the meaning you expected. Her hand with the papers in it dropped very slightly, as if her arm had momentarily forgotten its instructions. Gerald moved closer. "Camille, what is it?" She looked up at me. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, and it held the quality of someone standing at the edge of something they had not known was there. "Nora, this is real." It was not a question. "It is real," I told her. Gerald reached for the papers. Camille, in a reflex I had not expected, moved them slightly back before allowing him to take the cover sheet. He reviewed it for approximately 4 seconds, then he looked at me. His mouth opened and produced no sound for a moment, and he looked back at the paper, and then he looked at Diane. Diane had crossed the space between them. She took the cover sheet from Gerald's hand without asking. She reviewed it. Her reading glasses were not on, and she held the paper at a distance to accommodate her vision, and the gesture was such a human one, such an ordinary adjustment a person makes, that for a half second she was just a woman at her anniversary party trying to read a document at arm's length. Then her face changed. The champagne color of her dress suddenly seemed wrong against what was happening in her expression. It started around the eyes, a tightening, a recalibration. Her mouth pressed together once, briefly, and then released. Her hand, still holding the paper, lowered very slowly until it was at her side. Sylvia Ramos stepped forward from the edge of the room. I had not announced her presence. She had arrived at 8 o'clock, taken a seat near the perimeter with a club soda, and spent an hour looking exactly like someone's quiet professional friend attending a party. She was wearing a charcoal dress, and her reading glasses were on the chain. She carried a slim portfolio under her arm. "Good evening." Her voice was the voice she used in rooms where authority needed to be established without effort. "I'm Sylvia Ramos. I'm the estate attorney representing Nora Scott in this matter. I thought it would be helpful to be present in case there are questions about the documentation." The room's ambient noise had reduced itself. Not completely, because this was a party and people at the edges were still in their own conversations, but the 10 or 12 people nearest the head table had gone very still. Gerald found his voice first. It came out harder than he probably intended, the voice of a man who uses volume when he is losing the room. "What is this about? What documentation?" Sylvia set the portfolio on the nearest table and opened it. "The deed I've provided to Camille represents a completed property transfer. The beachfront estate held in trust by Nora Scott, approximately 4 acres on the Maryland shore with an assessed value approaching $42 million, has been transferred to Camille Beaumont-Tocquefer as of this morning. This transfer is fully documented, legally executed, and recorded with the county." Someone near the back of the cluster drew in a breath audibly enough to be heard. Gerald looked at me. The look he gave me was not the look he usually gave me. It was not dismissive. It was not socially calibrated. It was the look of a man in commercial real estate who has just understood that he has been standing next to something significant for 22 years and never once looked at it correctly. "How long?" he started and stopped. He looked at the deed again. "How long has this property been in trust?" "The trust was established by my parents before their deaths," I told him. "I have been the sole beneficiary for over 15 years. Gerald's mouth closed. He looked at the cover sheet in Diane's hand, then at the portfolio Sylvia had opened, then at me. He pulled his phone out of his jacket pocket, looked at it, and put it back without doing anything with it. Diane had not moved. Her hand was still at her side with the cover sheet in it. She was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on her face in 22 years, an expression I would describe as someone encountering an object that has unexpectedly turned out to have weight. One of Gerald's business associates, a man named Howard who had been at the Beaumont table for every event I could remember attending, said quietly to the man beside him something I could not hear. The man beside him responded with a single syllable. Camille was still holding the deed. She was looking at me, not at her parents. Her eyes had the particular quality they get when she is processing something emotionally significant but hasn't yet determined how to respond to it. There was something working in her face that I recognized from 17 years of mornings and evenings and ordinary and extraordinary moments together, and it was not anger, and it was not confusion, and it was not what I had braced for. It was something closer to understanding something she had not quite been able to articulate before. Diane set the cover sheet down on the table beside her, carefully, as if it required placement. Then she looked at me and she said, in a voice that was stripped of its usual social engineering, a voice that was just her voice with nothing layered on top of it, "You have had this the entire time." Not a question either. "Yes," I told her. "And you never said anything." "No." The hand went to her necklace. She held it there. "Why are you doing this now? What is this supposed to accomplish?" I kept my voice even, not cold, just even. 3 weeks ago, you submitted a fraudulent enrollment application for my daughter to a private school in Baltimore. You obtained her educational records from her current school without my authorization, and you provided a personal statement to that institution describing me as inadequate. Felicia Huang, the admissions coordinator, called me to verify the application because my name, the name on Josephine's school file, did not match yours. The room was very quiet now, all of it. Diane's hand tightened on the necklace. I was trying to help Josephine. You were trying to remove me. I let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. You described yourself as her educational coordinator. You left my name off the parental authorization section entirely. You used school records you obtained through a front office visit that did not include my consent. Gerald looked at his wife. His expression had shifted into something I could not categorize, except to say that it was the expression of a man who had just realized that his wife had done something he had not known about, and that this something had now become the context for every other thing happening in this room. Diane's chin went up. The social reflex was still there, the posture of someone who is accustomed to controlling rooms through bearing, but it was working against something underneath it now, and you could see the effort. Any grandmother would want the best for her grandchild. I simply made an inquiry. You submitted a fraudulent application. My voice did not rise. And you wrote a personal statement to a school administrator characterizing my fitness as a parent. I have documentation of everything. The application, the submitted records, the front office visit log from Josephine's school. My attorney has copies of all of it. Sylvia, without theatrics, placed a second set of documents on the table beside the portfolio. She did not explain them. She did not need to. Gerald put his hand on the back of a chair, not to move the chair, to have something to hold on to. Diane. His voice was quiet in a way I had never heard it. Did you do this? Not a question. The same grammatical shape as his daughter's 3 minutes earlier. Diane turned to look at her husband of 50 years. Her hand dropped from the necklace. She said, in a voice that was now entirely private even though 43 people were within range of it, I did what I thought was right for this family. You submitted paperwork on my granddaughter, Gerald said, and the way he said granddaughter was something I will not forget, something that carried the weight of a man who understood property and documentation and what it meant to put your name on something without authority, without telling me, without telling Camille. Without telling Nora. Camille would have agreed if I'd asked her. Camille, who had been standing with the deed in her hands throughout all of this, looked at her mother. Her voice, when it came, was very quiet and entirely controlled. You don't know that. Diane turned to look at her daughter. Something crossed her face, something that was not the social performance and was not the champagne and was not the carefully managed version of Diane Beaumont that had been running for 5 decades. It was something real and small, and if I am being entirely honest, something that looked briefly like a woman who understood that she had gone too far and could not find the route back. Camille, she started. You wrote a personal statement. Camille's voice had not gotten louder, which was somehow more significant than if it had. To a school, about Nora, without asking me. I was protecting our families. Stop. The word from Camille was not loud. It was final. She set the deed down on the table beside the portfolio documents, carefully, with the precision she brings to things that matter to her. Then she looked at her mother for a long moment and she said, I've been hearing my wife described as useless at events I organized and in rooms I invited her into for 22 years. I told myself it was just how you talked, just how the family operated, that you didn't mean it the way it sounded. The string quartet had stopped. Someone had turned off the recorded music. I was not certain when either of those things had happened. Camille picked up the deed again. She held it in both hands. $42 million, she said, more to herself than to anyone else. She looked up at me. You built this while they were calling you useless. My parents built the foundation, I told her. I protected it. She looked at me for a long moment, and I saw everything working in her face that I had learned to read over 17 years. Gerald had sat down in the chair he had been holding. He was looking at the floor. Howard, behind him, had taken a half-step back toward his table, the universal gesture of someone who has realized they are witnessing something private and has no mechanism for leaving. One of the women from Diane's social circle, a woman named Constance who had been at every club event I had attended for 20 years, had a champagne glass halfway to her lips that had not moved in approximately 2 full minutes. Diane was still standing. Her bearing was still present, but it was costing her something now. You could see it in the muscles of her shoulders, the way she was holding herself upright through deliberate effort rather than natural confidence. I apologize, she said. The words came out as if they had been manufactured somewhere that didn't usually produce them. If the application caused, it wasn't the application. My voice was steady. It was the personal statement. It was telling a school administrator in writing that I was inadequate as a parent. It was using my daughter's medical information to do it. I let a moment pass. My daughter has been in your home, at your table, at your club. She has heard things said about her mother in your voice, in rooms she wasn't supposed to be in, and she has come home and asked me questions I had to answer carefully because she's 8 years old and she deserves to understand the world as a place where the people who are supposed to love her actually do. Diane's hand had returned to her necklace. She held it there. For a moment, I thought she might cry. She didn't. Her eyes were bright, but she held it. I love Josephine, Diane said, and I believe, in the narrowest technical sense, this was true. Loving her would have been calling me first, I told her. Everything else was about control. The room held itself in the particular stillness of people who are present at something they know they will be describing for years. Gerald looked up from the floor. His face was the face of a man who has spent a lifetime understanding value and has just finished calculating something he cannot undo. He looked at his wife. He looked at me. He looked at his daughter, who was holding the deed to a property worth more than anything he currently owned in this condition, given to her by a woman he had permitted to be called useless at his table for 2 decades. He opened his mouth, and what came out was very quiet and without any of the authority he usually carried in it. We owe you an apology, Nora. A real one. Not tonight, but we owe you one. It was not enough. It was also, from Gerald Beaumont, the most honest sentence I had ever heard him say. I acknowledged it with a nod, and I did not offer anything more because that was all it deserved in that moment. Sylvia closed her portfolio. She looked at me. I nodded once. The documentation is complete, Sylvia said to the room, to no one in particular. The transfer is recorded. Everything Nora has provided this evening is legally final. She picked up the portfolio. I'll leave the copies with Camille. She looked at Diane one time, briefly, with the expression of someone who has seen the inside of a great many family situations and has made her own calculations about this one. And then she looked away and moved toward the door with the quiet efficiency of someone who has done exactly what they came to do. I stood in the room for a moment longer. I looked at Camille, who was still holding the deed, who was looking at me with an expression that had moved through several phases and arrived somewhere that felt like the beginning of a very long and honest conversation that I was ready to have. I looked at Diane once more. Her hand was on the necklace, and her chin was up, and she was managing something in her expression that required more effort than anything I had seen her manage before. She looked like a woman who had just understood that the story she had been telling about me for 22 years was not the story that was true, and that 43 people who had believed her version were now in possession of a different version, documented and legally recorded and impossible to revise. I did not feel triumphant in the way I might have imagined I would, standing in that room in that moment. I felt something quieter than that. Something that was less about victory and more about completion. Like a sentence that had been running for 22 years had finally reached its period. I walked to Camille and I put my hand over hers where she was holding the deed. She turned her hand over and held mine. That was the moment I had been building toward. Not the envelope, not the attorney, not the $42 million. That. My wife's hand turned over in mine in a room full of people who had finally run out of things to say about me. In the weeks that followed, the shape of things became clear in the way that things only become clear after a long period of pressure is released. Camille and I spent the first week in the particular kind of quiet that exists between two people who have a great deal to say and are being careful about the order in which they say it. We talked about the trust, about why I had kept it private, about what she had not known she was enabling when she let her mother's comments pass without correction. These were not easy conversations. They were necessary ones, and we had them. Josephine came home from Adela's the morning after the gala and asked how the party was. I told her it was eventful. She asked if Grandma Diane was there. I told her yes. She considered this for a moment and then asked if there was cereal and went to find it. Children are remarkably good at accepting the information they need and setting aside the rest. Diane Beaumont did not call me. She called Camille twice in the 2 weeks after the gala, calls that Camille took in the other room and emerged from looking tired in a specific way. Whatever was said in those calls, Camille did not detail for me, and I did not ask. The shape of it was clear enough from the result. At Thanksgiving that year, for the first time in our shared life, Camille and I did not go to the Beaumont house. We had Thanksgiving at our house with Adela and her family, and Josephine sat at the table and ate too much pie and fell asleep on the couch during the movie, and that was exactly what the day was supposed to be. Gerald called me once, 3 weeks after the gala. The call lasted 6 minutes. He said what he had promised to say, in his own way, which was still shaped by a man who had never found genuine apology easy but who was trying. I listened. I thanked him. I told him that what I wanted for our family going forward was honesty and proportion, and that I thought those things were achievable if everyone involved was willing to do the work. He said he believed they were. I still do not know if that is true, but the conversation happened, which is more than I would have predicted 18 months ago. Diane enrolled in what Camille described to me as a retirement planning class at a community center that January, which sounds like a small thing, but for Diane Beaumont, who had spent 50 years at the center of a social architecture she had built and maintained, the word community center contained a geography she had never before inhabited. I mention it not with satisfaction, but with the straightforward observation that people's worlds do resize when the narrative they've been using to define themselves stops holding. The beachfront estate is now in both our names. Sylvia finished the updated documentation in November. Josephine, who does not know the details and will not need to until she is much older, continues at her school, where she recently joined the geography club and has opinions about state capitals that she will share with anyone who asks. Her auditory processing appointments continue without interruption. Her college fund continues to grow. She is, by every measure that matters, entirely fine. And me. I am at my desk on a Friday morning with coffee and a case file and a quiet house and the particular feeling of someone who has arrived somewhere they built with their own hands over a very long time. I do not hate Diane Beaumont. I do not need to. I simply know now, with the certainty that comes from things being documented and legal and final, that her version of me was never the accurate one, and that the accurate one has been visible all along to anyone who was willing to look at it correctly. The envelope is gone. The deed is recorded. The attorney has moved on to other cases. What remains is my life, which is ordinary in the best sense, and my wife's hand turned over in mine, and my daughter's voice from the other room asking if we have any more of that cereal she likes. That is enough. It is more than enough. So, did I go too far, or not far enough? Tell me in the comments.